In Atlanta, the racial wealth gap is staggering. White households hold 46 times more wealth than black households. The Atlanta Land Trust is addressing this crisis by creating permanently affordable homes that help families build equity and stay rooted in their communities. By taking land out of the speculative market, ALT ensures long-term stability in neighborhoods threatened by rising prices and displacement. Learn more at atlantalandtrust.org. On this episode of Create the Village,
we want people to know, if you go to Atlanta, you're looking for a Black experience, you're looking to do some shopping, support Black businesses, you want to go to a hip Black-owned restaurant, like, you want to be at Adama.
This is Create the Village, a podcast about the intersection of public policy and community development.
My name is Egbert Perry. I'm the CEO and founder of the Integral Group, a real estate company that focuses on creating value in cities and rebuilding the fabric of communities. Culture isn't an afterthought. It's the foundation. Yet, in far too many community development efforts, arts and culture are treated as embellishments, something to add once the deals are done and the buildings are standing. But what if we started from a different place? What if cultural identity, creative expression, and a deep sense of belonging weren't just added on, but built in from the beginning? What if they help shape the very soul of the communities we create? That's the question driving today's conversation. We'll hear from Justin Chapman, a development executive at the Integral Group, and Dr. Fahamu Pecou, a celebrated artist, scholar, and founder of the African Diaspora Art Museum of Atlanta. Together, they explore what it means to center Black culture in community development, not as an ornament, but as essential infrastructure. They tackle gentrification, the loss of cultural memory, and how spaces like Adama can reclaim and reimagine place with purpose and power. This isn't just about aesthetics, it's about identity. It's about building communities where people don't just live, but belong, where they see themselves not only reflected, but affirmed. Let's listen in after this message from our sponsors.
In Miami, BRIC, the Black Real Estate Investment Council, is building an ecosystem where capital, development, and local opportunity converge. Powered by the Black Professionals Network, BRIC connects Miami-based investors, developers, and city leaders to advance sustainable real estate growth. Discover how this South Florida network is influencing the future of urban investment. Learn more at mybpn.org/BRIC.
Rural Enterprises is reshaping urban real estate, from mixed-use housing to office, retail, hospitality, and industrial projects, while delivering strong returns and lasting community benefits. With over $100 million in affordable housing completed and more than $1 billion in development underway, they're leading with data-driven strategies and smart partnerships. Discover how they combine asset management, capital investment, and advisory services to transform cities sustainably at ruralenterprises.com.
Okay, welcome to Create the Village. Today we're joined by Dr. Fahamu Pecou, an interdisciplinary artist, scholar, and the founder of the African Diaspora Art Museum of Atlanta. Dr. Pecou's work invites us to reconsider what's possible when we integrate art and culture into the way we develop our communities. In this episode, we'll explore the role of art in shaping vibrant neighborhoods. We'll examine the complexities of gentrification and ask how we can create spaces that reflect the people who live in them. Dr. Pecou, Chevalier, we are so excited to have you here with us today. Really appreciate it. It's my absolute pleasure. Looking forward to the conversation. Let's start by framing some of the questions this way. Tell me why art matters in development, why you believe that art and cultural expression should be an essential part of community development.
I think it is absolutely an imperative, this idea of art. It's not something that we can easily ignore or put to the side. Art is really just a reflection of our humanity. It is us talking to us about us, right? Like it is a way for us to also connect beyond the limitations of words. This is why you can listen to a song in another language and it make you cry. You don't even know what they're saying, but you feel that emotion, right? Like, I have this quote I always say, which is, in the future, historians will tell what happened, but artists will tell how it felt. And, it's this idea that art is not this thing that is this disconnected, disembodied expression or experience. It really is a reflection, a true reflection of, or a true imprint of our lives, right? Like it is who we are. And I always think it's really interesting that art becomes the last consideration oftentimes when we're talking about development, when we're talking about planning, when we're talking about education, when we're talking about all of these, really sort of lofty, fabricated ideas, that are designed to corral and contain our humanity. And I think maybe that's a part of the reason why art, gets pushed to the back burner sometimes, but it's because it's messy. We are messy, right? And it's, sometimes it is, there's a kind of politics embedded in art that people don't want to have to confront or deal with. But at the end of the day, not a single one of us grew up in a space with white walls, right? Like there's art in everything that we do, even if it was just the little figurines that your grandmother collected from yard sales and thrift stores that she had put on a shelf, or a series of decorative plates or colors, right? Like art always becomes a reflection of who we are and a way for us to soothe ourselves through the challenges that we face.
Mm, it's interesting. I had lunch with somebody yesterday whose educational background originally was in bioengineering, biochemical engineering. And he took that into essentially behavioral sciences.
Mm,
And he was talking about the link between space and how that space is designed and its impact on the brain.
mhm.
Colors, shapes,
Mhm.
volumes, sounds, texture, and all of that relates to what you're saying. It's very interesting. So you started to get at some of this, but what do we miss when we don't not just integrate, but kind of centralize art in place into what we're doing? What are we missing out on?
Yeah. Uh, so much. I mean, so many things are lost when we neglect that aspect of our experience, right? I think it's, again, it's an imperative that we begin to think about how we can center art in our lives, because ultimately that becomes the thing that allows us, again, to create experiences. Let's say it's a restaurant that we're building, right? You want people to come in, you want people to feel comfortable, you want people to have an enjoyable experience because you want them to return, right? And yeah, the food is a part of that, and the food is also art, right? But the environment that you create tells a story, right? The furniture you choose tells a story. The colors on the wall tells a story. The images on the wall tells a story. The uniforms, or the what the service people, the chef and the waiters and everybody wears in the space, tells a story, right? And I think the challenge is less that we don't always incorporate art. We just don't always think of these elements as art, right?
Yeah, we don't understand what we're doing. Yeah.
Exactly. Or we take it for granted. And we don't put the kind of intention and deliberation into these choices that we make that would then qualify it to be kind of conscious art making practice. And I think we have to be more intentional and deliberate about those kinds of choices because they have impact and they have affect on the experience that we have and that we ultimately want to create. Sometimes I take issue with that term, with the terminology art, right? Because it is a very loaded word that has a lot of connotation that in many ways becomes a barrier, right?
It's a separator.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's like wine, for example. There are a lot of people who are like, oh, I don't really get into wine. I don't know, because you've seen the sommelier and he does a sniff test. And yes, I denote a hint of jasmine in this, you know what I mean? You're like, what? I don't know what you're talking about. You know what I mean? And so, it becomes this sort of cultural and educational, intellectual barrier when it doesn't have to be.
You're hitting on something that I wanted to get back to because your work has such a strong sense of identity and culture. It's bold. And so as it relates to embedding art in our developments, how do these two ideas resolve themselves? In other words, you're talking about art as a barrier, but if there's I'm assuming that you don't really see a barrier between art, culture, and identity. So can it be used as something as we're designing spaces and places to involve people to help create a sense of belonging?
Yeah. Hey, in fact, I talk about this all the time. I grew up in an environment where I was a kid who could draw. All I did was draw. And or anything that was create like that required any kind of like creativity, right? So if I wasn't drawing, I was rapping. If I wasn't rapping, I was choreographing dance routine for me and my homies. If I wasn't doing that, I was playing trombone in the band. You know what I'm saying? I was singing in the glee club and in the choirs, right? Like I was always doing something related to art or creativity. And despite growing up in an environment that did not have galleries and museums and things like that, I knew I wanted to be an artist. I didn't really know what that meant, but I knew that that was how I saw, how I connected, how I could contribute to the world. And as I, matriculated from this town in South Carolina to Atlanta to attend college, that was my first time being introduced to this notion of quote unquote fine arts. Before that, I'd never even heard that phrase before. You know what I mean? I just like to draw. And so it was then, when I got to Atlanta that I started being introduced to galleries and museums and painting and sculpture and, all these kinds of, ways that people make art. Before that, I was just going to do cartoons because I was like, oh, I could draw cartoons and I can make a living. Okay, I'm going to do that. Right. But again, I think this idea or the language that we use around art oftentimes is more of a barrier than it is a bridge when it really should be a bridge. There's this really great essay that I always refer to, but I can never remember the name of the author. But the title of the essay is No Word for Art in Our Language. And this essay talks about all of these indigenous cultures that predate Western civilization and Eurocentric ideals and values that did not have a word in their language for art, but creative expression was central to the experiences that people had, right? So when you think about like the Ndebele in South Africa and the paintings that they would do with the patterns on the exterior of their homes and the beadwork that they do and the Zulu and the dances that they would do as they went into battle and the Native American different tribes and the different creative expressions that they had, right? Like art has always been a part of, this like human experience, but there wasn't necessarily called art. In fact, in many cases, it's a spiritual practice, right? Like priests and shamans create the things that we now refer to as masks and sculptures and we look at in museums. Like these were spiritual objects. They had a purpose and they served a function. It wasn't just for aesthetic purposes, right? It did much, much more than that. Right. And so I think it's much easier to reconcile the need for integrating art into our programs and projects across the board, whatever that is. if we dissociate the way that we have come to understand art from a Eurocentric perspective and really begin to embrace it as a part of our spiritual or human experience.
So we're dancing around the culture clash, this idea that there's a culture clash, in how art is defined. And that directly relates to this idea of gentrification and the clash of cultures that happens as neighborhoods begin to change, right? So I'm thinking about Adama and what you are hoping to do with Adama, and this balance between, as neighborhoods change and you have this potential for economic growth, how can we balance that growth without compromising the cultural identity while preserving some of what's existing, honoring the past as we're building the future? How do we reconcile this culture clash at the place level via including arts in development in the spaces we design?
Yeah, for sure. You made reference to, the African Diaspora Art Museum of Atlanta, or Adama, and a part of this, I think, challenge and solution. There's a sort of classism, privilege kind of thing that we have typically associated with our contact with art spaces, and in many cases, that those ideas are an imposition on people. It's like, this is important, this has value, you need to come to where we are and get this thing that we're trying to tell you will make you a better human being, right? As opposed to recognizing, identifying, celebrating, amplifying the ways in which community already do those things. You know what I'm saying? So it's not so much that what Van Gogh or Monet or Manet or, any of these like big name European artists that we can recite off the top of our head. It's not to take away anything that they've done, because they've made important contributions, right? Yeah. But that's not the end all be all, right? And when we erase the narratives of the people that look like us, of the communities that we come from, when we erase those narratives and we begin to tell those people in that community, like, nah, that doesn't have value, but this does. That's when you run into those challenges, right? And so one of the things Adama is really invested in is amplifying and highlighting Black experiences in Atlanta and beyond, in the African diaspora, and understanding and acknowledging that even in calling ourselves a museum that highlights the Black experience, we're not talking about a monolithic thing, right? Like, there are many, many, multiple iterations of Blackness that inform the way we think about Blackness. And so through our programming, through our experiences, through the ways in which we're engaging community, we are actively working to not only draw out our community and bring them to our space, but also, interrogate their needs and concerns. Like, what is important to you and how can we reflect that back? Which is not something that a museum typically does. Again, museums are typically built on a specific collection and a specific ideal, right? And then you're told that this thing is important and you need to understand this and you need to participate in this thing in order for your life to have value, right? We're saying your life already has value. Let us tap into that and reflect it back and show other people. I think part of the way that we, begin to mitigate some of the, again, the impositions of like gentrification and stuff like that is by not imposing our will, or somebody, or allowing someone else to impose their will on what is important and what is valuable in communities that they have not actively tried to ingratiate themselves into.
So expanding on that, your Adama is considering putting up a physical presence somewhere, right? So in some ways, and I kind of have two questions around this topic. In some ways, Adama is about to become a developer, right? Right, which is something that you may not have seen or thought through initially when you were standing Adama up. But I wonder how would Adama, or how would you define progress from a community development perspective as you yourself are becoming a community developer, not just an artist? What does that
Yeah.
progress look like?
hmm
What's the impact that you can have, right?
Yeah, I love that question because it's something that we've been thinking about a great deal. I'll use another example and thinking about the neighborhood of Castleberry Hill in the early 2000s, right? So between the late 90s, early 2000s, Castleberry Hill became a destination for artists. It was all kinds of vacant spaces and, walls and lofts and things like that that, artists were essentially squatting in, right? But bringing a kind of value to a community that had been largely overlooked and underappreciated, right? And then all of a sudden, developers was like, "Oh, there's something interesting going on here." And I moved into Castleberry Hill in 2002. By 2005, there were 15 art galleries in that neighborhood. And every Friday, first Friday of every month, there would be an art crawl. And all 15 galleries would have openings on that night. And the neighborhood would be flooded with people from all over the metro Atlanta area, going door to door, drinking free wine. There was art in the streets. There was music. It was a celebration and it was live. Like everybody was having the time of their life every first Friday. And again, like throughout the week, it would just be lots of energy because there was this arts attraction and engagement in this neighborhood. And I'm not talking about murals and stuff like that. I'm talking about art galleries and people were making money, right? And, as more and more the developers saw the value of what these artists had created in this space, they began to, raise prices and da da da. And eventually it kind of pushed everything out and then the neighborhood went down again. I tell that story to say that this is one example of many, not just in Atlanta, but around the country of neighborhoods that are at one point economically depressed. Artists move in, they bring a sense of value, a sense of beauty, a sense of appreciation, a sense of humanity to these communities, and then communities spring up around them. As we think about Adama, one of the things that we are very, very interested in is creating a model for the ways in which art, and particularly art, Black art, African diasporan art, can become a robust economic driver that not only becomes a space where people will want to come to gather and have these art experiences, but that they will also want to just be there, just vibes. You know what I'm saying? And so if I'm a restaurateur and I have a restaurant that has a specific African diaspora sort of menu, that's the neighborhood that I want to be in, right? If I am a retail outlet, maybe I import clothes from the Caribbean or from the continent or something like that. That's the space that I want to be in, right? Like if I have something to offer or that is a reflection of Black culture from regardless of where it is, I want to be in and around what Adama's building because that's where my audience is. That's where my community is, right? And we continue to describe what we're trying to build for Adama as a village. Not just, we're not trying to just build a building and then y'all need to come over here. We want to create a space where Black business can thrive, where Black art and culture and livelihood can thrive. You want to, even if you don't have a business, you want to live in this village. Yeah. And I think about this all the time because Atlanta has always had this been referred to as this Black cultural mecca. When I first came to Atlanta, you could find that cultural mecca in the West End. But in the last couple decades, it's been a lot less simple to pin down. Like, so if I'm coming to Atlanta, I'm like, where's the Black culture? Where do I find it? I don't know. We want to create that space. We want people to know if you go to Atlanta, you're looking for a Black experience, you're looking to do some shopping, support Black businesses, you want to go to a hip Black owned restaurant, like you want to be at Adama.
Your work has taken you around the world, around the country and the world. Do you have examples, whether Afro-based or other based, that you've seen that you can that you're drawing inspiration from? Like, okay, I can take some clues from this city or take some clues from that place. Give me a couple of examples maybe of what you've seen.
Yeah. So Paris has an entire district you walk through, and it looks like you're in a West African, city. There are open air markets, all kinds of shopping, for African-based businesses. It's called Le Port d'Or, the gold door, right? Like it's a neighborhood in Paris where you can find all of the African vendors and markets and da da da. I've always been moved by things like that. LA has this new development that should be opening pretty soon called Destination Crenshaw, which is, I think it's a couple mile long trail connecting downtown LA to LAX airport, but it runs through the Crenshaw neighborhood, and it's an intentionally black development, that centers black art, culture, retail, businesses along this path. That's another great model. I'm trying to think of where else. I mean, of course, on the continent there, a number of spaces like I'm thinking about South African in Cape Town, the Zeitz Mocha, the VA waterfront is another destination, with again highlighting South African art and culture. So I think there are little bits and pieces that I've taken, from all of the different experiences that I've had. London has an African cultural center, and when you go in on the ground floor, it's really dope. Restaurant that has this chef from Ghana who does like these amazing custom dinners, in a beautiful space. All of the decor is sourced from African designers, interior designers and fabricators. And I mean, just really thoughtful spaces that are curated in and around African diasporic culture.
Do you think that there has to be, and I'm thinking of the Miami Arts District now, do you think that there should be an intentional push to create these kind of districts, or is it better when it occurs more organically over time? 'Cause there's kind of tension between those two ideas. Is there one way or another that you think is better, especially for your vision?
I'm always proponent of organic coming together of themes and ideas because I think they are sustainable in the longer run. But when we talk about Miami, for example, the Wynwood district is an example of an organic an arts district that began organically. I think they had a general idea that they wanted to create something like an arts district, but if you recall, in the Wynwood district when it began, it was just walls that people could come and paint on. There was no charge to go there. It was just a, space where artists knew that they can go and get down. And then eventually they started doing things like, okay, now we have Wynwood walls, and during Miami Art Basel every year, they would, bring in different artists to come in and paint the walls in the Wynwood area. Again, free to the public, but it began to draw crowds, right? And retailers started to move in because they knew that these crowds would come and we could get these people come down here to see this art, but they're going to come in here to the shop. You know what I'm saying? And now when you go to Wynwood Walls, you got to pay a fee to enter. And yeah, you're still going to get a dynamic experience. It's great. It's absolutely beautiful. But they built that organically over about a decade to get to that point. And I think it maybe rather than an either or, it's a both and, right? Like I think there should be some intention behind it, but I also don't think it should be forced. Because at a certain point it can feel, what's the word I'm looking for?
Artificial.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting. We've known each other for a long time. You know that I am a creative. I have a degree in fine art. I'm a painter. I used to draw. Very interested in architecture, and you know me as a musician as well. So I sit in this space between the developer world, business world, and the creative world. And it's interesting to me because I hear developers or business people don't always see themselves as natural partners with artists and vice versa. So if it's the artists, they're talking about the suits. And if it's the developers, they're saying, oh, these artists are not practical. They don't know anything how to get stuff done. And so, which to me, it always falls on deaf ears. But there's a question given what you're trying to do again with Adama and what you've seen. What are things that each group could do to work better together or work more effectively? Is it communication? Is it vision? How do these silos? How do we break down these silos between these worlds to execute on synthesizing these ideas that you're talking about?
Hmm. I that's an interesting question. I can only kind of approach it from my own sort of personal journey. I went to art school, got a degree in fine art, and I needed a job when I graduated. And I lied on the application and said I knew how to do graphic design. I had never taken a graphic design class in my life. But, I started working, as a graphic designer. And one of my first jobs was, working in New York City in the late 90s, designing all kind of collateral, for like hip hop artists and, nightclubs, restaurants, da da da. And it was small enough that I was able to observe the lady Sandy who owns the company, how she got down and how she coordinated business, right? So much so that I was like, I remember one Friday I went in because she used to pay me cash every Friday, and I would walk into her office on Friday and she would have stacks of cash on her desk. She would count out $1,000 and hand it to me and send me on my way. And I remember one Friday walking in there like, she got 6 designers in here. Everybody's making different rates based on their level of experience and how long they've been here. Plus the people who ran the print shop. Like she's making bread, right? And I'm like, I needed to be doing what she's doing because all she did was sit behind her desk all day and smoke cigarettes and yell at people. You know what I'm saying? So I called up our boy Salah Anase and I said, Salah, yo, I got this idea. And so he was like, yeah, let's run it. So I moved back to Atlanta and we started Diamond Lounge Studios. And we started doing basically the same thing, like designing flyers for nightclubs, restaurants, hip hop labels, this, that, and the third. I'm sharing all that to say that this experience taught me the business side of things. Knowing how to draw, knowing how to paint, doing all that stuff, that's cute, right? But if you don't know how to handle business, that stuff is not going to take you very far, right? And so for me, the journey was one of having to straddle two worlds. Like I had to be a businessman and an artist my entire career. And I think that has allowed me, similarly to you, to be able to navigate both worlds, right? And understand that as an artist, your success was really contingent on your ability to this ain't a word, but to businessify your practice. You know what I'm saying? But also understanding as a business person, the skill of an artist is problem solving.
That's right. It's much more analytical, I think, than people realize. The creative
Yeah,
pursuits at their core are actually very analytical
yeah,
pursuits.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
I don't know that there are sometimes you'll hear people in finance talk about that. And a lot of times they'll actually hire people who have, literary degrees or arts degrees because they kind of know that there is an analytical side to it. But I think that idea gets lost. And I think what you're getting at, ultimately is that it's a language thing. It's the ability to communicate these ideas between worlds, because really, finance is a language. It's just a language. Art, to your point, is a language. Western art is a certain language. West African art, breakdown by tribe, different languages. And so I think that's the takeaway. Is it's really the ability to communicate between worlds that helps you out. Let me ask you this, bringing it back to Atlanta. Some of the stories you just told were really Atlanta history that nobody knows about. Atlanta, we've both seen this change in Atlanta over the last 25, 30 years, really, which is incredible to say. And you kind of hinted at the cultural identity, the shift in culture that Atlanta's grappling with. Are there any lessons, good or bad, that Atlanta offers for other cities? Again, I know that you're in Morocco, you're in Paris, you're seeing the globe, you're seeing the country. Is there anything that Atlanta offers to other cities in a positive or negative light?
Oh, most certainly. Most certainly. One of the things I often reflect on and actually have a deep, deep appreciation for is the fact that, when people often talk about that tagline of Atlanta being the city too busy to hate, right? But there's some real like magic in that as a black person in Atlanta, you learn to move in the world in a way that I think is unique than any other place that I've been. And and again, I've spent, a great amount of time on the continent and the Caribbean, across the United States. I've never seen a place where you can just be free to be yourself like you can be in Atlanta, right? And I mean that from the perspective of being a Black person, but also being a creative person. Let's take DC for example. People talk about DC being a chocolate city. And yeah, yeah, yeah. But yeah, but even then, there was a certain kind of chocolate that was allowed to move in spaces, and that chocolate had to have a certain, had to taste a certain kind of way. Atlanta, there's no restrictions like that. You don't have to shrink yourself or reinvent yourself or box yourself into a way to make other people feel comfortable. So you can go into one of the oldest business clubs in Atlanta and a pair of like jeans and Jordans and have a meeting with, 360-year-old white dudes in suits. You know what I'm saying? And nobody look at you funny and everybody treats you with the utmost respect because they know you bring value, right? Like everybody's experience here has value. The creative economy in Atlanta has always kind of been a major driving economic force in the city. And the business leaders from corporate to philanthropic to education to healthcare understand the value of that and are actively seeking that, right? And trying to be in conversation with that. And vice versa. The creative people here are finding ways to, have a conversation with the CEO of Delta about a project that, you know what I'm saying? That the Atlanta airport is one of the first in the country to have such a robust collection of visual art at every terminal. And, you know what I'm saying? It's a really interesting sort of marriage between industry, but also racially, that makes this city thrive in ways that other cities continue to struggle, right? So you can go to Dallas, and Dallas has a huge Black population, but they don't come across that line. You know what I'm saying? They don't come across that line, and when they do, it's a couple, maybe two or three, and those kinds of things they create a kind of stagnation. You can't go but so far when you're actively holding people back or when you're self-segregating. So I feel like Atlanta has a lot to offer the world in that regard, and showing and demonstrating that you could come from different experiences, that you could come from different backgrounds, that you can come from different professional environments and be in conversation and create something really beautiful.
Yeah, I feel the same way, having, moved here, moved away, and came back. And I think the idea that you're getting at is largely at the root of why we came back.
hmm Yeah, I mean, I tell people all the time, even in my own art practice, I don't know that I would be making the kind of work that I make if Atlanta had not been that intervening force in my life to help me shape my identity, not only as a Black person, but as a human being.
That's right. So to that end, and similarly, you said the word a few minutes ago, education. You're engaging intergenerationally through your work. What's the role? You are also not only a doctor, but you've been a professor. So, what's the role you see education playing in kind of fostering this understanding of the connection between art, culture, development, whether that is formal realms of education or informal, other forms? How do you see the role of education playing forward?
This kind of goes back to an earlier question that you asked too about the distinctions that people make between, certain kind of business types and the arts, right? And understanding the value that an artist's mind brings to all types of professional endeavors. I would actually love to see the re-implementation and reintegration of arts and arts appreciation in our very, very basic educational curriculum, because I think also that does a lot of work of also destigmatizing this word art, because it allows us to see how these things connect to our lives. And and there could be a arts component to every facet, every subject, in our curriculums, from kindergarten through high school and even into college. You know what I'm saying? Being able to demonstrate, if you're teaching Huckleberry Finn or something like that. But then you're also able to integrate into that lesson plan, some of the advertising media from that time period, right? You're also able to integrate, some of the like films that happened, that were being made during that time period, right? You're able to integrate some of the art that's being made by like Black artists during that time period who are responding to these things, right? That makes this Huckleberry Finn thing make even more sense to you. You know what I'm saying? Like, oh wait, now this is again, I think it's less about separating or distinguishing art as this thing over there, right? And more so folding it into all of the ways in which we live and experience the world. I think there's a lot of kids who struggle with math but have an appreciation for music. Right. You know what I'm saying? And if you're able to say, okay, look at this equation, but think about it through this language. Oh, that makes sense. You know what I'm saying? So I think, I think educationally we need we need a more concerted effort to return to incorporating art into the very basic curriculum.
Yeah, you're weaving these themes between the discipline of art or creative disciplines and early childhood education and even later forms of education. And it's interesting because at Integral, we see ourselves expressly as community developers. It's a real estate development firm. I spend most of my days trying to figure out how to get things built, but it's through this lens of community development. It's a holistic look, which includes health, right? It includes education. It includes creative pursuits. And so, everything that you just said resonates with, I think, how we see ourselves additionally attacking or addressing the world of development. And so I have one last kind of question for you, which is maybe if you could talk a little bit more in depth about Adama and not only how its existing programming weaves these things together, but how your plans for the future of Adama kind of express the vision that you've talked about.
Mhm. But yeah, I think to that point, our goal will ultimately be the creation of, again, a space that is a dynamic reflection of Black culture in its myriad forms, right? So it's not just oh, there's a museum, put your hand behind your back and walk through and look at some stuff on the wall, but you know, there are restaurants and retail, but there's a theater space there. There's a concert venue. There's so all of the forms of like creative and cultural expression that we might be able to imagine are embedded, in this village or on this campus, such that it becomes a destination. We're thinking about challenges of affordable housing and specifically trying to expand narratives around what affordable housing means, right? Oftentimes when we hear that, we're thinking, single mother with children. But what about creatives? What about people working in the gig economy? What about artists who need work and live space? You know what I mean? Like these are also people who are struggling with the challenges of affordable housing. One of the aspirations that we have for Adama, from an educational standpoint, is the to build a state of the art conservation lab where we can also begin to train Black people to work in this highly lucrative and specialized field. Right now, I think it's something like less than 1% of trained art conservators are people of color. So if we are able to, create a, art conservation lab, we can also train individuals to work in this field, but also provide this service and resource to museums, collections, and institutions in the Southeast region because there aren't any major conservation labs in this region. So there's all of these different kinds of things that we're thinking about that make Adama, again, not just a museum or a gallery, right, but a community. We are really trying to create something that will invigorate the economy in communities that have been underserved, right? Like, also thinking about institutional diversity, and not just programmatically, but also geographically. Right now, I talk about this all the time. This living here in the city. If you want to go to have an art experience, you're going to be somewhere between 10th Street and Buckhead. You know what I'm saying? And that's it. There's not really any, art spaces outside of that, right? And so we're trying to create spaces across the city, and at least inspire the creation of spaces across the city where communities can have these sort of art experiences that become economic drivers for those communities, as opposed to shooting all the resources into one part of town and then everybody else struggling.
That's right. Well, listen, I'm here for it. I just want to say that. And with that, I do want to thank you for taking the time to join us today. And more importantly, for inspiring us to think differently about spaces that we create and the people that we serve, more importantly. And you've reminded us that art is more than just this 2D thing that you go and see in the gallery, but it's a way to bring meaning to communities.
Indeed, indeed.
And so to the listeners, thank you for being a part of this important conversation. And if today's episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who cares about the future of our neighborhoods. And don't forget to subscribe to Create the Village for more stories about the people shaping the places we call home.
So Justin, that conversation that you and Fahamu had stopped me dead in my tracks. It was intellectually rich and emotionally resonant. It was really something worth paying attention to.
Yeah, it was a pleasure for me, not only because Fahamu is someone who I look up to and consider a friend, but he centers culture in his work and in his dialogue in a way that's really important, where he's reminding us that creativity, creative culture is really a foundation. It's not ancillary. And I think that makes developers, it challenges us to think about who we're building for, which is an essential question that often gets overlooked.
Yeah, and he doesn't just talk about art and culture. I mean, he reframes them as essential tools for telling the truth, for community building, and for pushing us to confront the blind spots that we now have in how we shape space. And he doesn't let us off easy either. And that's exactly what we needed, because it's really, art and culture tend to be somewhat of an afterthought, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the kind of top down, bottom up tension. And he's pushing us to kind of say, well, whose story is in mind? Who are we really talking about? And back to that fundamental, for whom are we designing and building? At the end of the day, as developers and as people in real estate, we're building for people. And we need to make sure that we're telling holistic stories in our work.
So maybe you just answered the question that's coming to my mind, given that you're in the real estate space and you're also a creative. What stayed with you most from that exchange? What challenged or changed the way you think about the work that we do?
Yeah. I think actually this idea of kind of memory versus self-expression, I think from a creative, the way the creatives are viewed and the way the arts are viewed tends to get categorized as the self-expression realm. And the way we encapsulate it from a development standpoint, it tends to be about memory, right? We're capturing these moments and times, and maybe we use it as a marketing ploy or something like that because this place used to be cool. But really, when I think about the fact that it's people that we're building for and people filling buildings, it's really the cultural zeitgeists. We're actually trying to create space for where people want to be. And so making sure that we're tapped into that zeitgeist of what's happening in a place, and there can be multiple zeitgeists happening at one time in different parts of a city, different parts of a country, but making sure we're thinking about where people want to be and what's important to people is central to the conversation. And that's a challenge in and of itself. That's not easy to put your finger on, and it's not easy to make the case for oftentimes.
Yeah, so you said something there that he did sort of challenge us with, and that is that we sort of sidestep the issue of culture, and as I said earlier, treat it as if it's an afterthought and window dressing, instead of recognizing it as the force that helps to shape identity, roots, belonging, and drive the economic life of a community. And so all of those things are so core to what art and culture are, yet we don't treat it or celebrate it as being that central.
Yeah. Yeah, that I think that's right. That is kind of the status quo. I have a theory that Fahamu and I talked about, and I mention to people every so often, and that really is that from my perspective, the city follows culture. It's not the other way around. And if you you can think about a lot of different cities. I spent time in DC. I think about places in New York, and it's especially acute here in Atlanta when you look at the neighborhoods and the areas of town that are developing and that saw a lot of activity in the last cycles. A lot of the times it was the creatives who paved the way, who made those places interesting and created the kind of energy that paved the way for development. And I think you can say that's true on parts of the East Side Beltline. I think you can say that's true in a lot of Midtown. I think you can say that's even true in central parts of Buckhead. And so as a creative, I was a part of that energy. It's replicated itself in Washington when I think of the creative legacies of the Shaw neighborhood on 14th and U Street, where you have names like Duke Ellington, Marvin Gaye, and Roberta Flack, whose legacy not only set the tone, but to this day are utilized as part of the development strategies that commercial developers are using. So for me, it's this idea that the city follows culture, and we should never wait until the end to think about that fact.
So that clearly what you're saying is on point in a lot of respects. If you're in Atlanta, you see the awakening to the realization that Atlanta has a particular culture that should be capitalized on and expressed. We're seeing more of these murals in different places to help remind us of who we are. And so going back to a question I asked earlier, I'm taking from what you said that you have in fact had a shift, or maybe you always were there just because of who you are or how you're built. But I assume that there's been a shift for you and that you're rethinking how central we are or need to be in putting culture, ingraining culture in our work, right?
Maybe I would say less of a shift and more reinforcement of the idea, because I've been kind of holding that tension for a while. But, over the last 15 to 20 years, really being in the space has reinforced that idea that culture is a little more central. And now the challenge is how to centralize it in the work that we do. And, that's the hard part, right? Because when it comes down to accessing capital, making the case for how a certain development strategy can work and be sustained, there's kind of a history that there's not always a good match from what might be viewed as more risky avenues or risky uses. And so the challenge is for us to be creative in facilitating culture as a central aspect of development beyond just the decorative, beyond murals, but how can we make sure we're housing artists or facilitating places for the arts to thrive? And I think because we're working on some things now, that's not always easy. But first, we have to get comfortable with holding the tension, with acknowledging it and holding it as we work on it.
Yeah, so, well, and I guess that's kind of what Fahamu was trying to start putting pressure in the system to address. So he took aim at our education system, right? In effect, he said we've spent decades sort of narrowing the definition of intelligence, pushing creativity to the margins and treating the arts as luxuries rather than necessities. And so, given how long we've been doing that and how ingrained it is in the way in which we look at art and culture, that critique is somewhat urgent, right?
Absolutely. It's a stinging critique, really, and not one, I think, in America or in the West that's easy to overcome, because we have kind of marginalized the arts as somehow special. Only special people do it, only special people can be involved. At the same time, we've kind of devalued it from an educational, pedagogical perspective. And the reality is that there are multiple kinds of intelligence. Some people have purely mathematical intelligence. There's emotional intelligence. There's musical intelligence, spatial intelligence. And so, what Fahamu is asking us to do from a societal perspective is reframe and rethink what we value, and therefore who we listen to as experts. And that's a fundamental shift that he's asking us to make.
So, all right, so let me ask you this. What would it look like if we stopped treating art as an accessory and instead made it more central as you described it? Where central to how we build, how we educate, how we imagine communities, etc., etc. What would that look like if we put it front and center?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. This point may be difficult to express clearly, but I'll give it an attempt. In some way, there's an irony, because the creative arts are seen as such a risky thing, right? But in a way, if you create that fluidity where you're including a broader set of perspectives and people in the mix, whether it's at the strategy level, whether it's who's occupying space, in some way, you should be able to design and build projects, and I'm thinking back to real estate, that are actually less risky, because you've got a more diverse range of participants, stakeholders, viewpoints, and therefore life inside of your project from beginning to end, from the concept through the occupancy of a given project. You should actually be de-risking and making your space more interesting to a broader set of people, which should give it a longer life, more longevity. So if we define that as fluidity, if that means we're innovating, if that means we have to take a more humane, a broader and deeper humane perspective on what we're doing and how we do it, then so be it. But I think in the long run, if we can open ourselves to this concept that creativity and the creative arts are a bit more central, we should actually be de-risking ourselves.
Fair enough. I mean, that would make communities and areas more interesting. But as you know, what stayed with me, at least, as a developer or creator of places, is that developers often shy away from the artists. Why? Because they're kind of out there. They're kind of those crazy people not in touch with the fundamental things that we care about. What's the rent? How much square footage do you need? What is the return on those dollars? And, give me some specificity to it. So there are all these things we're looking for, finite or very, very crystal clear answers to, and artists tend to be a lot more out there in that the creative process is messy and really doesn't fit what the underwriters are looking for, which is the point you made earlier. And so, given how messy that is, and it should be messy because life is messy, people are messy, and so are the communities that we serve. But that is what stayed with me from it all, because there is the yin and the yang. On one hand, you're trying to get something very clear that you can send to a lender or an investor and get a commitment. And at the same time, you want something that is going to be, as you said, valuable and interesting over the long haul, which means it has a significant amount of creativity and grace in it, not just black and white. And that's the challenge. That's really the struggle, right?
Yeah. No, it's again that this idea of holding tension, but there are, I think, ideas that we all carry. If you are a developer who doesn't see his or herself as affiliated or connected to creativity, you might have that view that the creative process is very gray and messy, not understanding that actually it's also highly analytical. There are rules to seeing things, there are rules to sound and music, and there are rules to the creative process, which, while messy, does have some structure to it. And conversely, if you are creative, and as you know, I teach a course, development course, which is housed in an architecture school right now. So I'm having this conversation constantly. You might be an artist or an architect or a musician, and you think that, the evil developers are coming through and all they care about is money, when that misses the point that the development process is intrinsically creative and messy, highly creative, highly uncertain. And so I think part of our responsibility is dispelling these myths about each other and be kind of open to hearing from each other. And simultaneously, it's the old good to great adage. We have to pursue that relentless pursuit of discomfort with things being messy and uncertain as we are working towards goals. And so just a quick example, as you know, I'm a musician. That's been a primary avenue for creativity for me. And I may have an idea in my head or hear an end that I'm going after, and I may do my best to work towards it. And it may not, the end result may not turn out that way. It'll get close, or it'll be a facsimile, but it may not be exactly what I'm hearing. But I'm following rules along the way. But I have to be okay with the happy accidents that I discover along the way. So I think there's a bit of dispelling myths and getting comfortable with being uncomfortable that is our responsibility in the process.
So what you're really saying, just to cut to the chase, is if we're serious about building places where people truly belong, then we have to stop demanding simplicity, predictability, something that is just cut and dry, and start embracing complexity. And even though you say it's not complexity, it actually has rules and so on, the truth is, because of how we've been socialized in this profession, it does show up as complexity.
Yeah. And that's right. It is complexity. I think that's a fair descriptor. And at the same time, if it's too clean, if it's too neat, and it fits that mold expressly, the truth is that we're probably missing something. And that's probably the idea that's behind why people, I'll say fear, that might be a strong word, but their hair kind of stands up when they hear, well, these developers got a project in my neighborhood, because they're afraid that their story's going to get wiped out. Maybe the place is going to become a little too homogenous. And so I think as we're working in different areas, especially some of the areas that we are working in, our job really is to create frameworks and projects and processes that can hold the tension.
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation about when you are developing with community in mind. So that's community development as opposed to just being real estate developers. That has its own dynamics that go with that require, by definition, embracing some of that complexity that you're describing.
That's right. And I think we have a responsibility, to make that real, which is not always the easy route, but centering people and community, especially when you're coming into places where there's a depth of existing community fabric, and centering that as part of your process, as an essential piece of your process, which sometimes slows you up, sometimes takes you in directions you didn't see coming, is a responsibility that we have, but that's not the easy route. But, if it was easy, everybody would do it.
Fair enough. So, and by the way, Fahamu said something that lingers with me. Historians will tell what happened. This is his quote. Historians will tell what happened. Artists will tell how it felt. And that one line captures what's been missing in so much of modern development. It's the piece about how it's felt, because that's a human, emotional thing. And so the emotional truth, the human texture, the soul of the place is what often gets left out or is missing. So, Justin, thank you. Thank you for causing that conversation to happen and for bringing the conversation to light. And obviously, my deepest thanks to Dr. Pecou for reminding us that building that village, the village that means more than bricks and budgets, it means honoring the spirit. And so, thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Next time on Create the Village.
So the big provocation of our research was, what if we could change the meaning of square footage? What if we could make a smaller square footage feel and act as if it was much larger?
Create the Village is produced by Felicia Ann Rosenuha and Chantrell Brewer. Executive producer Rick White. It's edited by Brennan Robinson. Create the Village is a production of the Integral Group LLC, copyright 2025.